Fantastic. So that then takes us on into the next presentation, which is where I've already placed my bet that Richard is going to mention that word biodiversity pretty early on. So Richard, if you are there, do you want to turn on your camera and your microphone? I can see that you're sharing your screen. This is amazing. I'm loving the order in which you're clicking those buttons. I will let you share your slides first, and then we'll make sure that we can hear you. Beautiful. We can see your slides, but we can't see you and we can't hear you. Otherwise, I could talk to your slides. That would be fascinating, wouldn't it?
Well, it could be, Sarah, and you probably make more sense than
I don't know.
Than I will. And you've already stolen the biodiversity wonder. Well, it's in the title. Yeah. So I'm actually thanks for the platform. Really interesting talks to date, and I'm going to follow on from this trust subject, and I think hopefully you'll see that it's quite a good segue into what I'm going to talk about. So we're talking about a project that I'm at the Natural History Museum in London, but I'm working part of an international project that involves groups including Natural History Museum, where we have geoscientists and biologists, and we are working with colleagues at Imperial College, and then several groups in the Philippines, particularly in Mindanao and in Manila. And what we're actually looking at is how can we develop ways of what we're calling biopositive mining that is actually socially inclusive. And I'm going to talk a bit about our project, which is actually funded through the Global Centre on Biodiversity for Climate, which is an initiative from DEF, the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs in the UK. And they're working to look at projects that are helping to deliver the arresting climate change, but also looking at nature positive and biodiversity positive project. So hopefully you'll get a flavour for that as we go on. So moving to the next slide, the first. Have we moved on? Yeah, we have. So I'm not going to read through it totally, but the rationale for this project is there is a closed mine in northern Luzon. It's an old porphyry copper mine called Santo Nino, which mined several 100 million tons of low-grade copper ore in a block caving project. And it was closed in 1982 at the time when mine closure plans weren't really necessary. And the company actually walked away from this one. So the legacy is an abandoned copper mine with a negative surface legacy of an abandoned and degrading infrastructure, waste rock, and a tailings facility that were left. And the local, largely indigenous community moved back in to do agriculture as they would, because this is a highly populated area. The mining was carried on in the community here. Obviously, the loss of the mine meant people had to go back to other jobs, and a lot of them went back to subsistence farming. But obviously, with the legacy of this mine, it left a big sort of negative hole in the community. So the aims of our project were, and we put this front and center, was to engage with all stakeholders, and in particular here, it's the indigenous people in the community. Now, it's under Philippines law, if you work in areas that is under the jurisdiction of indigenous peoples, you have to have that agreement, because, of course, historically they have rights to occupancy in these areas, and they have different laws of land ownership. So the first thing that one has to establish is that relationship with that community. Before we did any of the work, which was to assess the mine legacy site issues, the geo, the bio, the water, and even to do any work with the social side, we had to get this agreement with the indigenous peoples. But we were very keen to co-produce a future strategy of realistic interventions, recognising this has been left since 1982, and we have to work with what's been left. And so what we were looking there particularly was to look at a programme of mitigation potentially metal recovery of where we felt that was appropriate from the waste waters, revegetation, nature and carbon positive sustainable landscape use after that. So the year one target for the project, we were funded to deliver this quantitative baseline data. That year has finished. We've done that. And we've just secured year two funding, which is to implement a series of macrocosm interventions and assess the applicability for those for a long-term plan for the site. But in order for us to get the year one work done, we had to go through and put, as I say, the social aspect front and centre. And so the rationale for inclusion was local communities are often excluded from the rehabilitation of legacy mines. And this is the case all through this region, the Philippines. And of course, it leads to suspicion. We just heard actually that well espoused, not engaged, so therefore they're suspicious. So they should be an integral part of the process to ensure success and sustainability. It's legally required, but it's also, they have to be a part of this. Because actually what we found through the course of this, that the views, beliefs, perceptions, aspirations, knowledge, skills and experience are actually critical inputs to this whole process. And a lot of the things we're going to try this coming year are based on their observation. And obviously their trust is essential for true final closure process. So that's why it was front and centre. So we started off initially with local political agreement. So the top left there, you can see the use of recycled Starbucks bags here, biodegradable and freely available. So of course they were quite useful. But local political agreement first with the mayors of the barangay, the district, the Tublai district in Benguet province. We then had to move from that political agreement then to the community leadership. So these are the indigenous leaders. On that route, we had to comply legally, obviously, and make sure that the police were sort of smiling when we were on site with them because we were doing the right thing. Obviously, engaging with local custom was important. Having a respect for culture, which included, some of the ceremonies that related to strangers coming and working on sites. We had to be assessed for really for our ethical, the reason as to why we were going there and whether we could be trusted to deliver. Actually, one of the interesting things was embracing difference. So the photograph you have there is a local guy who's significantly shorter than one of our Scottish geologists who came on site, and obviously very culturally different, but it was a wonderful example here of the differences of our team. And obviously that with that, we were built a local team. So there was a lot before we even went and picked up a rock, took a water sample, anything. We did all that because actually, I'm sorry, I can't see the top things there. Key social needs for activities there were something called a certificate of precondition, and that's to work with indigenous peoples, and that's a governmental requirement. And then actually to get something called a gratuitous permit. I love that, the word, the gratuitous permit, which allows you to work and collect flora and fauna. So this is obviously respecting biology as well as cultural aspects. And so actually our license to operate was dependent on getting this NCIP clearance and permit, which meant submission of a work plan, hosting of the activities in the barangays through the political process, full disclosure meeting with the community, working with them on a validation and decision making. And then there's a memorandum of activity that we had to sign with them. And that was a certificate of precondition from the NCIP that we'd done all of that to be able to work on these lands, which are effectively controlled by these indigenous people groups. And then on the right-hand side there, we went through a similar process to get the sort of ecological clearance to work, to do the sampling and so on. So again, there was a political process, applications there to the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, then a clearance that allowed you to collect that material, that it was being assessed that it wasn't actually going to cause issues with the biodiversity aspects of the ground. So we then had the gratuitous permit. Again, that led to more another MOA signing with the DENR, and then that all had to come together with ethical clearance, which you needed that certificate of precondition clearance from the ethics offices at the Philippines universities in order to get the project go ahead to get on the ground. Now, it sounds incredibly laborious, but what that built was trust at all levels with the local peoples, with the politicians, and everybody knew what was going to happen, so that there was kind of no strangers arriving on the site, that because people had been engaged, there'd been public meetings, there'd been stuff in the local press and so on. There was this, even if there wasn't the trust at this stage, there was at least the recognition that they knew what was going to be happening. And so part of that early process was trying to understand local priorities. And it was really interesting when we did a Wordle of what people were felt was really important for them. And actually, minerals weren't very high in there. There wasn't the sort of perception of a polluting legacy. They were more worried about their livestock, their water, their crops. Actually, they're really interested in organic things. They were very, very closely embedded with nature. So they had this understanding of the plants that they were using, which was really interesting and really was very helpful for us when we were looking to kind of build some kind of reconstruction. Jobs was important, but you can see their education and training and so on was equally important. And it's great to see the Jeep word there, because if everyone's gone to the Philippines, it's just covered these wonderful jeepneys, which is the major form of transportation. And they wanted to make sure they had a road that they could have transportation in and out for people to get in and out. So that was great. And so we then were able to assemble our team to get onto the site, and our project, top right there, had modules that were based around the social subsystem. So this was a program of working closely with the community and really harvesting their ideas about what they thought were the issues that they had. Where do they think, what have they done to mitigate it in their own way, naturally, and so on. So we were learning from sort of local work there. Our technical subsystem was the geological bit. So we went there, we did rock samples, we used drones to do remote sensing, digital terrain models, multispectral cameras and LiDAR cameras and so on. And then on the ecological subsystem, we had a monitoring program of the microbiome. So really important to take water for chemistry, but also for microbiology to do eDNA sequencing, the same for the soil, the waste dumps, as well as looking then at the higher plants, the basis of those ecosystems and working with those, and indeed some of the invertebrates that were in the soil and the waste material. So the social aspect was really carrying along at the same time. So it was really good. We had the social team on the site the same time as we had the technical teams. So, and because we'd actually embedded within our team people who spoke the local Austronesian languages, so they were able to communicate directly. And of course, then when we had the technical team, because they were on site, they were able to answer any questions of the social team as we were working. And we collectively met for lunch in the local sort of hall where people could just come and drop in if they had issues, and they would come and talk to us. And they generally got a view, and they helped us a lot, actually, with the physical access and all of those kind of things, because they were really embedded in the program from the beginning. And that was really good. We were able to talk to the farmers directly when we were soil sampling. We were able to sort of show them what, when we found material that related to the old mining activities, and we were able to find out how they'd mitigated sites as they went through, as they came onto the site in the 1980s. And so there was a major field program, and we took a lot of people on the site at one go, but it was good because it felt to be excellent to have, rather than have almost like people coming and going, have everybody there together, and we could bring the community together and talk to them. And the bottom left here, this was our lunch activities, and when the people knew that we would be there, they could come and ask us what people were doing. And one thing we found, actually, bringing in drones was absolutely fabulous way to engage with all the youngsters. And so the local school kids were just, they really amazing how they became drone pilots by the end of the program. And it was a really good way of, because we were able to show them the maps, we could map where their farms were and so on. And it's the first time that people had seen where their map was spatially with respect to, and we could show them their crops, because you could pick the crops out with the resolution of these cameras, and you could tell one farmer that your crops are doing better than the other guy on the other side of the valley. And so all of this was really very interesting data for them. And then we ended up with the first year program of having a social validation meeting. So what we undertook was that we would not share any of the data in the public realm until we'd shared it with the public, with the communities. So we had this validation meeting that was held in November, and you can see we had local population came, they were able to ask questions, because what we did was we assembled a bunch of information that was published in plain language, in their own language, in the local language. We put that ahead of time, had it translated not only into Filipino but into their local Ilano language that is the lingua franca in that area, the Austronesian language. So we did one for the geological data, the remote sensing data, the water chemistry data, the ecological data. That was pretty important because we'd identified there a range of plants, particularly some that were hyperaccumulators that could be perhaps utilised in the future for mediation projects. But then we also were working with the farmers as to what crops they were planting, because we wanted to make sure these things were not, uptaking metals that could be problematic. And then we were looking at the soil texture, looking at invertebrates, in this case like earthworms, but we're doing metagenomics, so we get an understanding of the full functionality of the soil and how well that was behaving, and whether there were problematic things in the soil there. And then the social program also derived that. So what came out of that meeting? Well, we really believe that we got trust from local stakeholders, because what we wanted was their buy-in for the Year 2 program. And actually, I just put a copy of the letter we received actually at that meeting. And it was actually written to DEFRA from the barangay captain, so the local politician, and the head of the Indigenous Peoples Mandatory Representative. And they were actually requesting that DEFRA give us Year 2 funding. So if you like, this was an amazing piece of paper to put into our project case for funding for the second year, because what was very poignant in here is the fact that they acknowledged that we had, this was the first research project that had fully engaged the community from children up to professionals. And I think this was very touching, actually, and we felt pretty humbled that we had achieved that. So we had an enormously careful steps at the beginning to work with that local people, but to the point now where, in a way, if we don't keep our funding going, we're going to try and make sure we don't disappoint. So what we've done for Year 2 already started. We've got some bio interventions that we've already were plotting to put in there to clean up the mine wastewater. That's something we tested in the lab back at the museum, and we're going to be able to hopefully introduce that as a way of removing some of those the metals that could be problematic. Luckily at this site, then, the major problem is copper, which we can recover actually, and that can be recovered, captured, and we can bring that down as a sulfide, and it can be sold, because there's plenty of mining operations in northern Luzon that's actually marketable. And then working then on macrocosm experiments with farmers to seek the appropriate soil treatment and planting. And that links into looking at the microbiome. So because we've done a lot of work on both contaminated sites and sites that are non-impacted in that region, we can give them some advice on perhaps some bioinoculants that might help that soil recovering, but also some simple things like maybe some pH mitigation and ways of locking up that. Because actually the tailings pond in this case is a fantastic asset because it's the only flat area in a very mountainous region, and it makes wonderful raised beds. So what we are doing is working with them to make sure that they aren't growing things where their roots will permeate down into the problematic parts of that tailings. So that's part of the year 2 program, is to make sure that we can they can allow them to do this agriculture, but in ways that will be not detrimental to health because of the metal toxicity. And so that's where I'd like to leave it. Thank you, and really happy to take any questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Richard. So everyone, if you want to put your hands together for the fantastic Richard Herrington, absolutely brilliant. Richard, I've got a bucket load of questions for you, but I'm keeping half an eye on time. Yep. So if you're okay, we'll keep going straight across to Leanne, especially seeing as she stayed up for us in Australia. But if people do have questions for Richard, please do feel free to pop them into the Q&A or into the chat, because I think this is just a fabulous case study for everybody to learn from. Richard, it's brilliant.